Okay, good morning everybody and welcome to the latest in Tarot Trust instalment of the webinar Wednesdays. Today's session is going to be focusing, due to popular demand and requests from earlier participants, on the subject of building safety. Obviously it's a very topical subject and has been a very topical subject for the last few years now. I'm delighted to be able that we're joined today by a real expert in the field. It's Debbie Larner, formerly the head of practice at the Chartered Institute of Housing, and also formerly the lead on building safety matters. Before I do, just a few housekeeping matters. You can or turn on your videos if you want, so that other people can see you, so that we don't sort of interrupt Debbie and we can control that. If you've got, you can make full use of the chat function. Hopefully you'll find that at the bottom of your screen. I'll be monitoring that as we go through. If you want to ask questions as well, we can ask, we'll pick up questions, and Debbie's let me know that at various times we'll have natural pauses when we can pick up questions, but we will also have a Q&A session at the end of this as well. I'm going to try and multitask as we go through, so I'll be monitoring those questions. If you want, and as we've done in some previous sessions, there's also the option to kind of unmute you and to ask and to have a bit of a discussion as well at certain points as we go through, but hopefully we can fit that into the flow. I know we've had a quick chat with Debbie before we started, and I know she's got lots and lots of information. I guess the one proviso is that this remains a very live area, so there might not always be the answers to some of your questions. So we'll do our best to answer everything we can. I should probably also just mention as well that the focus of today is very much on the people side of building safety. Often with building safety, when you hear about it, it kind of evokes thoughts of complicated and very complex regulations, of which there are a lot. We are going to try and kind of cut through some of that, and Debbie's very much going to focus on the human side of building safety, because ultimately, you know, that's the thing that we think is important to you and what you're interested in. Obviously, some of you may be living in high-rise buildings, sometimes defined in the legislation, I think, as over 6 stories high or 18 meters, but there are elements of this that relate to everybody. So therefore, hopefully there'll be something within here that is of interest to you. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Debbie, and I'll be here in the background and hopefully managing things as she goes through the presentation. So enjoy, and Debbie, thank you very, very much for giving your time today to talk on this vitally interesting and important subject. Thank you.
Thanks, Darren. Nice to see you, Michael. It's been a while. I was feeling fine about doing this, and then I saw Michael pop up and I was like, oh, here we go. Be nice. So as Darren said, while people perceive the building safety bill to be about buildings over 18 meters, actually it is it does relate to buildings above and beyond that, and the whole new regulatory framework is about all buildings. So I just wanted to clarify that. I shared my screen beautifully when I practiced with Darren, but obviously now it's not there. 2 seconds. Back out. There we go. Share screen. Come on. Right, so as Darren said, I'm Debbie Larner, formerly of CIH, and now I'm working on my own. specifically carrying on the work around building safety, but also doing some work around professionalism and what that means for the sector as well, off the back of the white paper. So I will touch on that a bit later on. So I'm going to talk, I'm going to probably, as Darren said, I'm going to throw quite a lot of information at you, and I will pause for you to ask questions. If you want to ask a burning questions, I'm quite happy to stop and try and pick that up. And if we want to have a bit of a dialogue about something, that's absolutely fine as well. So I'm going to look at the new building safety legislation, how it fits in with other legislation. I'm going to touch a little bit about the new roles that the legislation introduced, because there's quite a lot of confusion about what those roles are. I'm going to look at some of the new requirements specifically around the building safety case and the resident engagement strategy. I'm going to talk a little bit about the findings from the social sector building safety engagement practice group, which is not that easy to say. I want to touch a little bit on stigma, and I know last session you had looked around stigma, but I think it all relates. We'll touch on the white paper as well as it relates to building safety, and a little bit about what your organisation should be doing to prepare now. So I'll crack on. So the draft building safety bill is now over a year old, it's 18 months old, and when it was introduced it was in draft form, and the intention was, as you see from that diagram, to put resident safety at the heart of everything. So to make sure both not only residents were safe, that they felt safe, and everything else flows from that. A lot of the bill is around introducing a new regulator and amendments to existing building acts. Relates to the construction and design of buildings. What we're really going to focus on today is part 4, which relates to the in-occupation phase. So when buildings are in the management stage, and that relates to all buildings that are in existence now, so existing buildings. So yeah, it was July it was introduced, and it's a really detailed and comprehensive piece of legislation. I think it's about 200 pages if you fancy reading it. And it's a seismic shift about how buildings are made safe, a shift in emphasis for organisations to prove that they're safe. And it creates a whole new regulatory framework. And as I say, the regulatory framework applies to all buildings. The regulator will expect all buildings to be safe. Some of the specific requirements relate to buildings over 18 metres, but there's an expectation, whether that's low rise, whether it's houses in multiple occupation, whether it's care homes, sheltered housing, there will be some expectations of good practice and things that organisations should be doing. When we are talking about some of the legislation stuff, we are talking, as Darren said, about buildings over 18 metres or 6 stories. And the interesting thing about the bill is it's what we called enabling legislation. So it doesn't really, it's 200 pages where it doesn't actually give a lot of detail. And what it means that the detail will come out through secondary legislation. And the reason that government have done that, it makes it easier to amend and to put amendments and creates more flexibility. So for example, if they decide to lower the scope of buildings from 18 metres, they can do that fairly easily. So as I said, a lot of it's going to require either regulations, statutory guidance or secondary legislation. So you'll see here, we're waiting on a whole range of stuff to come out to give us information that we haven't actually got yet. So we're waiting for information on the resident engagement strategy, we're waiting for information on the complaints process, on who the accountable person is, etc., which will all be coming out over the next 12 to 18 months. And the bill sits along 2 other things as well. It sits along the Fire Safety Act, which is now an act which amends the fire safety order. So it means that it brings in the structure of external walls, claddings and balcony into the legislation. They were excluded before, and where again entrance doors to flats were excluded from the fire safety order, it's including those as well. And that was enacted earlier this year. And then there was another consultation, which is around implementing the recommendations from the Grenfell inquiry, the phase 1 of the Grenfell inquiry. And a lot of that is quite technical detail. Phase 2 is much more looking at the people element, and we're still waiting for what comes out of that. So the bill went to a select committee. So before it was going to go through as a proper piece of, not a draft piece of legislation, a proper bill, it had to face scrutiny. And some of the things that the scrutiny committee picked up on, as you know, is about leaseholders and having to pay for defaults and defects that weren't their fault. And the select committee said basically it wasn't fair, that leaseholders should have to pay, and that government should explore other ways of recompensing and making sure that leaseholders don't. And that's still a live argument at the moment. We haven't solved that. It looks like the new Secretary of State for Housing, Michael Gove, agrees that leaseholders shouldn't have to pay, but he hasn't really said much more. They questioned buildings in scope being 18 metres. They said that height was not the exact measure of risk, and you should be looking at vulnerability of residents in the building and people's ability to evacuate. And I think that's something the government haven't put in the legislation yet, but it might happen as the bill goes through Parliament. They wanted some more clarity on the accountable person, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And they wanted more information on the building safety manager as well. They wanted the competence framework to be published alongside the bill. There's a lot of speculation at the moment about the role of the building safety manager, who it is, etc. And I will touch on that again. The government took some of the recommendations on board, but not all of them. So what they did say, when the building safety moved from draft to an actual bill in July of this year, a couple of things they changed. So they changed the time limit for residents to make a claim from 6 to 15 years. That sounds quite good. That sounds quite good, but actually, if your developer has gone bust or they've changed or merged, it's quite difficult up to 15 years later to get a claim in. Positively, they've introduced care homes and hospitals if they're higher than 18 metres. So listen, sort of half listen to the vulnerability. Again, they said that building owners have to explore ways to meet the remediation costs, so the existing challenges around fire safety, before passing these to leasehold, and evidence everything that's been done. They talked about, again, they recognised that the accountable person wasn't always recognisable if there's more than one potential accountable person. So this might occur in buildings where you have maybe multi-use. So you might have a building with a gym or shops below where there would be more than one accountable person. And what they've said is it's up to the landlord to recognise who's the boss, who's the principal accountable person. And they've clarified that we're quite vague in the bill about fire safety risks, and they've now clarified those as being fire spread and structural failure. So we know this is going to be expensive. Government have put some money into it, specifically in terms of removal of cladding, but we're not seeing them say much about remedial works that need to be done. So there's been some estimates of costs about the introduction of the bill and what it will cost. So we're looking at really big numbers. Government's impact assessment estimates the cost at just over 600 million, but actually what we're talking about is in the billions. So when people have done some work on this, the new regulatory system could be about £90,000 per building in scope per year. And then some of the costs associated with creating the safety case for the building, around 75 million in the first 5 years. So and again, we've got the cost of the building safety manager. People are looking to recruit around salaries around £50,000 to £70,000. 70,000 per building safety manager. And then the remedial bills we're looking at, estimated costs are now looking at 1.19 billion to actually make buildings safe even before the legislation starts. So when landlords are looking to think about the costs for this, it does have an impact on new development they can build, on some of the challenges around the green agenda, zero carbon, you know, what can be afforded, and what that will impact in terms of rents for residents and putting rents up potentially. So this has been and will continue to be quite a long process, and quite a shockingly long process when you think it's been 4 years since Grenfell, for over 4 years since Grenfell. So we originally had the building safety bill in July. We're now at the point where the bill is passing through the House, so it's going to House Committee and it's in committee stage at the moment. We're expecting that probably until March or April of next year. Government are talking about royal assent for the bill, so when it becomes an act in April, May of 2022. Maybe another year on top of that to introduce all the secondary legislation that I talked about, with the act kind of going live in autumn of 2023. And again, this is my best guess, but there will be a transitional period, which we estimate will be about 7 years, because the new regulator, the new building safety regulator, will have to review and inspect all of the buildings in scope and sign off all the safety cases, and that will take some time. So really, before everything is fully functioning, we're probably looking at 2030, but things will be gradually introduced before that as well. So don't think of 2030 that there's nothing to do until 2030. Really, organisations are going to have to start preparing now, and I'll talk about that a little bit. So I talked about the 2 key roles that are being introduced. The first one is the accountable person, and this is the person who is actually responsible for the building. It might be the chief exec, it could be an individual, or it could be a company, or it could be both. And I talked as well that when it's not really clear who the accountable person is, because there might be more than one, there will now be a concept of a principal accountable person. So basically, this person is responsible for the fire and structural safety of the building. And this is when we are talking about buildings over 18 metres. This is the person who is accountable, hence they're called the accountable person. They're the person who is legally liable if there is a fire or if something happens, and that's criminally liable as well. And the key thing about the accountable person is they cannot delegate their accountability to anyone else. So they remain accountable. And that's quite interesting, because I think a lot of people thought that that they could delegate their responsibilities to the building safety manager. They can delegate functions and tasks, but they cannot delegate their overall accountability. So again, the building safety manager will be appointed by the accountable person. It can be, confusingly enough, a company or an organisation, but there has to be a nominated individual. There has to be someone who is named that residents know who that is and can go to with concerns. And that's really, really important from the residents' perspective. So they'll have their own statutory duties set out in the bill they'll have to comply with. They manage the day-to-day responsibility for fire and structural safety. They manage the building in accordance with the safety case report, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. They have a close relationship with the accountable person. If they think any of this isn't going well, they have to keep informed. And they need to have relationships with any managing agents in the bill. And also the building safety regulator, any notices that the building safety regulator issues, they have to comply with those. But again, the accountable person is still responsible. And importantly, the building safety manager is responsible for communication with residents as well. Now, that might not be a nominated individual, it could be a different setup, but there will have to be someone who is responsible for information and passing information on. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. So I talked about safety case report, and this is new, and this was brought in. So Dame Judith Hackett, who carried out the initial independent review, She came from big industry, nuclear, petrochemical, and safety case reports are really common there. It's about identifying the main risks in the building. So all the main hazards, what measures are in place to manage the risks, how measures are maintained, what checks are done, and how the safety case will be kept up to date. This is brand new for housing, and we're not used to this kind of scrutiny. They've also defined what it isn't. It isn't just a tick box exercise. It's not something that you can just do once and go, it's done. It can't just be a collection of information on the building, which you've just already had pulled together, but that you haven't provided any narrative to. It has to be accessible so people understand it. And it can't just be seen as something that needs to be done to please the regulator. Quite a lot of organisations have, in the early days, pulled together their safety case reports and sent them to the regulator, what they call the shadow regulator, and they've done entirely this sort of stuff, and the regulator just sent it back and said, no, not good enough. So this is a really intensive piece of work for landlords, and they have to do a bespoke safety case report for each of their buildings over 18 metres. There isn't an off-the-shelf model for this, because the safety case report needs to recognise the people who live in the building, the vulnerability, things around evacuation. So it's not a one-size-fits-all, and that will not work. The other thing, again, at the heart of this, and that came out from some of the things that Dame Judith was looking at, but also the Grenfell inquiry, is around giving the residents a voice. So providing the information they need to understand how safe their building is, develop a resident engagement strategy, specifically around building safety and involving residents. And again, I'll talk about that a little bit. Landlords need to establish a complaints procedure for residents to raise safety concerns and handle those complaints, and that is sitting outside normal complaints procedure. It has to be a bespoke complaints procedure. And this talks to some of the things around when residents weren't listened to. Residents expressed their concern at Grenfell that there was fire safety hazards, there was issues, and they felt they weren't listened to. Residents will be able to escalate their concerns directly to the building safety regulator, and the building safety regulator will have to create a complaints procedure for that to handle residents' concerns. So again, there's no barriers to residents going straight to the regulator. But again, there are challenges as well. Residents have to have their own responsibilities and rights, and the accountable person can issue a notice requesting that the resident remedies things as well. So there's responsibilities there. It's expected that sort of these expectations and these new requirements will come into force within 12 to 18 months of the bill receiving royal assent. So if it receives royal assent, say May, June next year, we'll be looking at 12 to 18 months after that. So really, in general terms, that's not far away. And another key part, and I talked about the resident engagement strategy. All landlords will have to develop a resident engagement strategy for each of their buildings in scope, and good landlords will do resident engagement strategies for all of their buildings that they feel should be in scope as well. So they may choose to do all care homes, all sheltered schemes, all low-rise schemes under 18 metres. Good landlords will be doing this and not just doing 18 metres. So there's some principles set out in the resident engagement strategy. I think government are really keen not to give a template for this, because again, it shouldn't be an off-the-shelf thing. Each resident engagement strategy should be bespoke for the building it's addressing. And while there might be some commonality, it's around tailoring it and working with residents to get that resident engagement strategy right for that building. There's some principles for what the resident engagement strategy should have in it. But again, as I say, it should be, landlords should be working with residents to make sure this works. And just talk a little bit about the duties on residents. There is an expectation that residents will comply with requests for information from the accountable person, and not to act in a way that creates a significant risk to the building. There's an expectation they'll refrain from interfering with safety items in and around the building. So the obvious, like popping open fire doors, fire chutes, fire safety equipment, etc. And as I said before, the accountable person can issue a contravening notice and require residents to pay to repair or replace the safety item. Pause there. Has anyone got any questions or anything that they? There's a lot of information.
That's great, Debbie. Yeah, absolutely. There's been some great questions that have been coming through on the chat function. Hopefully, can you hear me, Debbie? Is that okay?
Yep.
Yeah. Oh, brilliant. Okay. Yeah. I think so. Sandy in particular has been raising some a few questions, really interesting questions, particularly around timescales. And I think that you've answered some of those things over the timescales. I guess a further one though would be, you've talked about the building safety manager and the accountable person, but does the legislation, I think it does, doesn't it? I think it's prescriptive on this very point, make provision for when there are changes in those positions?
The building safety regulator has to agree the appointment of the building safety manager. We'll talk about competence a little bit later, but the building safety regulator has to be assured that the building safety manager, whether that is a function or a person, because it could be either, has the right capabilities, and they can veto an appointment if they don't think it's the right one. Also, any changes to the building safety manager, it has to go through the building safety regulator as well. It's also very like the building safety regulator, the accountable person has to be agreed by the building safety regulator. So it will not be that you could just suddenly put Joe Blogg's housing officer as the accountable person. That would not be acceptable. The person has to, there's some specific proviso about who the accountable person can and cannot be. And it has to be someone who has accountability. It says something about the ability to receive rent or something really bizarre like that, but it actually means the person who actually can have accountability for the building, and it would have to be a senior person, and it's quite clear about that. Hopefully that clarifies that.
That's great. So another question which has been coming in, which I'm going to ask it in a slightly broader way, actually, but it's the whole issue of the fact that the regulations at the moment, the way that they're drafted, is essentially for a lot of things, it's either you're high rise or it's not high rise, and if it's you're not high rise, then you don't, and it's not above a certain height, for instance. And as you highlighted earlier, the select committee had some concerns there, because obviously this could be an issue. It's not necessarily the height of the building that creates the risk. It might be the height of the building, but it could be the complexity of the building or the building design, or it could be the residents. And Val has highlighted there about whether vulnerable residents, perhaps even in a lower story building, for instance, are being placed at risk. I guess, therefore, the question, to what extent do you think that there might be sort of a change in the legislation? Because I don't like to defend the politicians who are putting this in place, but I suppose what they say, one of the things that they'll be saying is, well, they have to start with a certain threshold. There has to be parameters. You've got to start somewhere. Do you think that that's going to change over time?
I think it's like, I think there's two points to that. One, what's deemed by the legislation, which at the moment is over 18 metres. But that doesn't mean that good landlords shouldn't be applying this across all buildings where there is multiple occupancy, really. You know, you're not going to apply it to a house, but it's up to landlords to create resident engagement strategies, safety cases in buildings where they think there are some vulnerabilities, and not just say, well, the law says I need to do X, and I only need to do it for buildings over 18 metres. Good landlords will be doing risk assessments on all their buildings to determine when they want to go over and above. Do I think that the 18 metres will be reduced? Yes, I do, because of the way they've designed the legislation is to make it easy to change that. And you're absolutely right, Darren. I think there was discussion that the meters was going to be reduced to something like 12, and I think that brought something like 20,000 more buildings into scope. The new building safety regulator would not have been equipped to be able to deal with that amount of buildings. So I think it has to create something, and it's gone with 18 metres. I think in time that will reduce. But again, I go back to there's no reason why landlords shouldn't be looking this across the piece.
Thanks, Debbie. There's a couple more questions. I think maybe we pick up maybe one or two, and then we'll move on. One of them, which is coming from Alan, which I think we'll pick up later when we talk about competencies, about whether they're qualified staff. So if we maybe come back to that, Alan, in a bit when we're talking about competencies, that probably makes sense. In terms of legal responsibility, if we're dealing with the legislation itself, I suppose there's a critical question there about the case of an ALMO versus the council, and who's going to have responsibility under the accountable person, and whether they're able to just pass on that responsibility. I mean, my initial understanding is that you can't pass on responsibility, but you can pass on duties. So, is that right, Debbie?
It was one of those really big questions about who the accountable person is in that setup. And I think the principal accountable person in that setup would be the ALMO.
Right.
Because they have the day-to-day responsibility of managing the building. And it would feel a bit weird for an arm's length local authority who hasn't had day-to-day responsibility to be made accountable for a building that they don't manage. But it might be that you might deem someone in the local authority, depending on the relationship and the arm's lengthness of it. So you might say a local authority, that an ALMO where the local authority manages some homelessness hostels, you might create a situation as an accountable person within the local authority, but the principal accountable person is 99%, 100% really likely to be the ALMO.
So presumably in that arrangement, whilst you've got the ALMO appointed as the accountable person, and therefore the need to satisfy the building safety regulator through that, then there might also be, even if it's not within the management agreement with the local authority at present, the high likelihood that there'll also be a kind of overseeing role as part of the management or contractual agreement for managing the properties with the council, and need to satisfy the council also that the requirements are being met from the, so you kind of get that additional scrutiny, perhaps. Possibly,
yeah, and I think it'll be interesting to see how that does play out, because the local authority own the stock, so you know that the ALMO is the landlord, but actually the local authority actually owns that stock. So it's one of those ones that we'll see how it plays out. I think the role of the accountable person sort of been sorted, but that kind of relationship within the management agreement, it'll be really interesting to see how that is played out. Okay, I'm gonna invite you to continue, because and before doing so, Sandy's made the comment that you can see many problems with this. I think as we go on, the complexity grows, doesn't it? So yeah, I'll really thankful that we've got you here to kind of navigate us through this, Debbie. This was a little bit about the social best. I don't know if I'm going to say this. It's too ridiculous title, but the social sector building safety engagement best practice group. So running alongside some of the work that Dame Judith was doing, they had a best practice group. Who were looking at some of the best ways to engage and inform residents around building safety. So when we're talking about resident engagement, we are specifically talking about engagement on fire and structural safety. So there will be other resident engagement mechanisms in place, but it's very specifically to look at that. And I just wanted to sort of share some findings and to get your thoughts, really. So they did a report, I think they published it March time this year. And it's worth a look, actually. It's got a nice infographic. I was saying to Darren earlier, I couldn't manage to extract the infographic, but so this was I mean, some of it feels a little bit, what, really? You put a group together to recognise that one size doesn't fit all. But equally, I think, you know, some landlords actually need to know this stuff. So it talks about tailoring engagement to residents' needs and the type of home, around different types of learning preferences when you are conveying safety messages and evacuation procedures. Again, using a range of communication channels, making sure that disengaged hard to reach residents can access fire safety information. Not just putting something up on a wall that says course of action to be taken in the event of fire. It should be reinforced through messages, through briefings, through video boards, etc. Just putting, you know, we've all been there, we've all seen, like in hotels or whatever, you've got that thing on the wall that says this is how you evacuate, and you never look at it, and if a fire happened, actually you never remember it. But reinforcing those messages. It's around those relationships with fire and rescue services as well, getting fire and rescue services in, getting residents to engage with fire and rescue service, having that honest dialogue, and enabling that open and honest engagement on fire safety and structural safety. And again, if we go back to Grenfell, there wasn't an ability for people to feel confident to raise concerns. So I think this is the sort of conclusions. And they came up with 6 kind of principles. I think, Darren, you'll send this presentation out afterwards anyway, won't you? So I know this is probably quite a small screen, so
yes, absolutely. All materials will be issued after, probably within the next 24 to 48 hours, along with a copy of this recording as well.
Brilliant. So again, it building on those, it came up with the 6 principles around building trust. I think trust in terms of building safety, and again, I'm really clear that this is around building safety. Some of these principles work obviously across the board. Building trust, explaining why access is needed and why things, rather than just telling people not to do stuff, why it's important. Why is it important that you don't prop open that fire door? Using the range of communication messages, delivering the service well, understanding any mitigating factors. So rather understanding why residents might be refusing you access at times, and not just issuing notices, you know, just actually having that dialogue, and ongoing conversations and listening to residents as well, and targeting personalised approach for residents as well. So I think part of that you kind of go, well, yes, that's quite obvious, but equally I think it's good to have it set out, and I'd be interested in your views on that as we work through. How am I doing for time, Darren? I want to talk a little bit about the social housing white paper, otherwise known as the Charter for Social Housing Residents, because this came about for other reasons, but I think the reason that this came about was because of Grenfell. So why? Well, I think, as I said, the Grenfell Tower tragedy completely reshaped, I can't get my head around their new name, sorry, MHCLG's programme of work, and it made them rethink about what social housing was, their attitudes towards it, how residents were treated, and we saw that there was a real challenge around how the trust between residents and landlords, about the accountability, etc. And for the first time ever, ministers actually sat up and thought about things slightly different. And we saw at the time, I think it was 4 or 5 housing ministers ago, Alok Sharma came out and did a consultation. And I know certainly TAROE and TPS were involved with that, where they engaged with residents across the country and spoke to a lot of residents about what they cared about and what mattered to them. And this led to, in August, the Social Housing Green Paper, which is the precursor to the White Paper, and also for a call of evidence for social housing regulation. So what should regulation look at? What should it focus on? Does it focus on the right things? Is existing regulation where it doesn't really look at the people elements, it only looks at financial elements of organisations' performance? Is that right? And I think the conclusion was very much it wasn't. And then after the Green Paper, again, ministers and officials met with a lot more people and got views of people about what was important and what mattered. So actually the White Paper is quite seismic, and it did make a shift of approach a little bit. And I wanted to, I know last time you talked about stigma, and I know you talked about the It's Not Okay report, but I think what Grenfell did, among other things, was polarised the stigma and stereotyping of social housing. And I've listened to quite a lot of the Grenfell inquiry, and it's been quite shocking. This whole lack of respect, residents not being listened to, discussions about institutional difference, the Green Paper, again, following on from that, lots of stuff around stereotyping and stigmatising of social housing. The Ombudsman, again, when they started looking into their complaints, it was, although it kind of demonstrated as service failure, actually when they unpicked it, it was about poor attitudes and behaviours of staff. And then again, when I was at CH, did this report on See the Person, with See the Person, where they talked about residents feeling like they were second-class citizens, and us and them. And all of this has led to the Social Housing White Paper, which again very much talks about professionalism, competence, respect, courtesy and professionalism. So alongside this kind of really hard building safety bill, which does to a certain extent look at bricks and mortar and people, there's a review of attitudes and behaviours, which is very much stemmed as a result of Grenfell. I've got a little video, but I don't think I have time to show you, so I will move on. So we had the Charter for Social Housing Residents, and I think it's about a year ago since this was published, which is shocking really, because I don't think we've heard huge amounts about
last November, Debbie. Yeah, November.
Yeah. So in a year, I'm sure, I know there's stuff going on, but it's a year. So there were 7 chapters, and actually, if you read through this, if you take out chapter 7, which is a bit of a, I don't know, it's so different from the rest of it because it talks about home ownership, which again stigmatises social housing because everyone should aspire to own their home. But a lot of it is focused on residents, neighbourhoods, listening to residents, respect, being treated with respect, having complaints dealt with. And there is, I've never seen a white paper that's a residents' charter before, and I've never seen a white paper ever like this before. So the heart of the white paper for me is the right thing. Quite what that manifests itself into, I'm not sure. So the white paper heralds a return to consumer regulation. So it heralds a return to actually how a service is delivered to residents, how repairs done, how's antisocial behaviour treated, etc. So it returns us back to where we were pre-2010. But what it's introduced is a brand new thing around safety, which was never in consumer regulation before, and it will be explicit in the new consumer regulation objectives going forward. They've, as well as giving us an accountable person, a building safety manager, a person accountable for the consumer regulation, they've also given us landlords to nominate a person responsible for health and safety. Can't quite work out how that sits into the hierarchy of responsible, accountable persons, but we'll see. there's an expectation that the regulator for social housing and the HSE, and I didn't say earlier, but the building regulator, the new building regulator will sit within the health and safety executive. And the reason it's doing that is to give it teeth. So there will be an expectation for them to have a memorandum of understanding. So what they're trying to avoid is that a complaint goes to the regulator of social housing, which might be about a concern about fire safety, but it doesn't go to the building safety regulator, so it's missed in some way. So it's about creating that kind of seamless link. They also put a consultation on smoke alarms and carbon monoxide detectors and measures around electrical safety. An expectation around effective engagement with residents on safety issues, and that is above and beyond the resident engagement strategy. And then the best practice group that I mentioned earlier will continue to work within the building safety regulator to ensure that residents' voices continue to be heard, and that there will be residents involved within the committee structure within the building safety regulator as well. And there's lots of information on the health and safety executive website. I can add the link in if you are interested in being involved in that. So what we have got also within the white paper is a draft, a set of tenant satisfaction measures. I've not included them all. I've included the ones I think relate specifically to building safety. So things about keeping properties in good repair, satisfaction with repair service. There's a specific new one on maintaining building safety, compliance, but also satisfaction with the health and safety in their home. And again, complaints very much sits into this as well. I think quite a lot of us felt quite disappointed when we saw these draft measures, because we felt they were kind of a bit tick boxy and a bit measuring outputs rather than outcomes. There's lots of work going on behind the scenes, and I think the regulator will be going out for consultation on these new measures. So I'd encourage you to have your voice in these and to have measures that actually really matter to you. And I just wanted to give you a heads up on, although this is some way in the distance, it's not, with the amount of work required to prepare for both the building safety bill and the white paper, landlords should be doing stuff now, and if they're not, then they should be, to get things ready. And also you don't need to wait for legislation to be enacted to start to deliver, to create a resident engagement strategy, and to do quite a lot of other things beforehand. So it's really important that now, and I would challenge you to challenge your landlords if they're not doing this, is to start developing a resident engagement strategy, start mapping out what that looks like. I think some landlords are waiting for guidance from government. We're not going to get guidance from government. Landlords should be big enough and able enough to be able to start doing this already. Landlords should be doing a big exercise about where they are in relation to the safety expectations in the white paper. Where are we now? What does the white paper expect from us? What's the gap analysis? What's our plan? And again, I would imagine most are doing it now, but there is it's unveiled a huge amount of by kind of a lot of organisations have undertaken more rigorous fire risk assessments, and that has unearthed a huge amount of remedial work that's going to be required to make buildings safe, even before the new regulatory frameworks. There's a lot of work to be done on that. A training and awareness strategy for all staff, for board and residents, an ongoing training and awareness strategy as well. And I've talked about this quite a lot. It's about understanding which buildings they want to be within scope over and above the regulatory regime. You know, are we going to be including supporting housing? Are we going to be including care homes? Are we including hostels? Legislation doesn't say you have to, but should you? A piece, and I think one of the questions touched on it earlier, and I'll end with competence, is about within the organisation, do they have the competence in the organisation to deliver against their duties and responsibilities in the building safety bill? And if they don't, they need to start thinking about how to get that competence within the organisation. And again, determining who the accountable person is for each building. If they haven't already done it, and I know a lot of organisations have already recruited building safety managers, don't wait for the legislation to tell you to do it already. It gives you time to kind of test and learn. You know, put your building safety manager in, what's working, what isn't, refine it. There's quite a lot of good practice out there around how people are recruiting, what they're recruiting for. Some are recruiting for technical skills, some are recruiting for what they call emotional intelligence, some are recruiting for softer skills, some are recruiting different ones with different skills, so they can have a package of BSMs who make up the whole package as well. People should be undertaking risk assessments for all buildings in scope to start building up their safety cases. The amount of evidence needs the regulator will want from landlords for their safety cases is huge, and they need to do one per building. It's a huge exercise, and landlords should be doing it now. So this is the sort of stuff I think maybe as either active residents or members of resident board members, you should be challenging your organisation on. And I just want to talk a little bit about competency, because competency underpins all of this. So there will be, competence will be key. So there will be a new competence committee sitting within the new building safety regulator. There will be a new suite of competency standards for the statutory roles. So there's 3 statutory roles within the legislation. That's principal designer, so people responsible for designing the building, principal contractor, the people responsible for building the building, and the BSM. Strangely, it's not the accountable person, it is the building safety manager. They are statutory roles, and they will all have to have a competency framework around them. And then there's some way to need to think about how do you assess, certify against those competence, that those roles or functions have the right level of oversight. There's work going on at the moment. There is a British standard, so system with the BSI. There is all in existence a British standard for overarching competency. So within building safety, building and structural safety, what's the overarching competency framework? There's a PAS, which is, I don't remember what this stands for, publicly accessible standard, again developed within BSI for the regulated roles that I've just talked about. And then there will be a series of competency standards for the specific roles as well. So there is a competency, there will be a specific standard that sets out the competency for the building safety manager or the nominated building safety manager. So that's all in development at the moment. Again, I would urge landlords not to wait for those standards to come out to recruit their building safety managers. You know, there's a lot of detail and sort of competence that the people need already. Competence doesn't also need it to be vested in just in one person. So competency can be invested across teams as well. So you could have a building safety team where you've got someone who's really capable of resident engagement. You've got someone who's able to deliver fire risk assessments. You've got someone who can deliver on other parts of the statutory duty. You don't need to invest all of that competence in one person, which makes it quite difficult. That's kind of a word on competency. I'm kind of keen on time. I think that's me. I appreciate I've thrown lots and lots of information at you, but more is more. So
brilliant, Debbie. Thank you. Wow. That's it kind of makes you stop and gasp, doesn't it? Just the degree of complexity and the range of things that landlords and residents are going to have to kind of navigate their way through. There's a lot of both comments and questions that have been coming in. So if I pick up a few of those now, is that okay, Debbie, with you?
Yeah,
I'll try to be nice.
Yeah, I'm not going to read the questions because they're a bit.
Yeah, it's okay. So I've been monitoring as they come through. One of the things that I'm going to kind of pull together as a question was the issue about. It was quite clear as you're going through a strong message, particularly if you're a landlord, to hear was don't wait and see, and it's quite remiss of you to, if your landlord's adopting that approach of waiting and seeing, then that's not a good tactic to be taking whatsoever. And that came through loud and clear. I guess if I switch that question on its head, though, are there any things that you think that residents might or should be doing now in order to maybe either assist landlords with that process, or to scrutinise and hold their landlords to account as part of that process?
I think residents should be pushing and for organisations to start pulling together working groups around the resident engagement strategy. It's because they have to be tailored to the building, and it's no good to just say, oh, we'll borrow from Clarion, or we'll borrow from L&Q, we'll just take theirs. There's also stuff about being conduits for the information and engagement as well, being champions for building safety, or the approach to it in your building. So helping support information about the whys and wherefores, why you shouldn't do something. So why it's important that you don't prop open a fire door. It's not just because we're being authoritarian, it's because it actually impacts on fire safety. So it's about using residents to be champions and spread those messages about the importance of that. And I think in terms of scrutiny, you should be holding your landlords to account if they're not starting some of this work now. Absolutely not. I mean, scrutiny, this is absolutely things that the safety cases, the resident engagement strategy, are things that there's no excuse not to be starting now. I think you should be championing for a building safety manager. You should be championing for organisations to talk to others who are actually doing some of this ahead. But I think the key message is, if your landlord's not doing something on this now, there's a real push on why not.
So again, to flip that on its head a little bit, Debbie, the takeaway message is, if you're not aware that your landlord has been doing any of those things, then now is the time that you should be able to ask to find out what it is, because at the very least they should have answers to those questions about what either they've done or what their plans are to address some of these issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a similar thing around that, not just building safety, but it's the white paper as well. Regulation of social housing is really clear that they will not accept you saying, well, we were waiting for the detail. Yeah. We were waiting for the detail to come out about what regulation is going to look like. We were waiting for you to tell us what the tenant satisfaction measures were. The regulator will issue some tenant satisfaction measures, but they're the minimum. You should be looking at tenant satisfaction measures around building safety that work for your organisation as well. So you should be thinking about developing the measures that work for you over and above what the regulator says.
Okay, I'm going to bring Sandy in a moment. She's got a hand up waiting to ask a question. Before I do so, just to make sure we don't miss anything that's gone earlier. There's been some earlier questions around scope and then also enforcement. So again, if I bring those together, I think I'm right in saying that this is not the regulated housing sector or social housing sector, as some refer to, specific. This applies across the board. So one of the questions was, well, if you're in the private sector, who's going to be regulating this? And I think that comes back to, do you have anything to maybe say on that? And how strong do you think that body's enforcement powers are going to be?
Yeah, so it's a good point there, and I didn't clarify it. The Building Safety Bill applies across all private sector, social sector, any building with over 18 metres. The Building Safety Regulator is responsible, is the regulator for all those buildings. So that is across multi-tenure, across sectors. The Social Housing Regulator, however, by the nature of its name, is only responsible for regulation of social housing. So I think there's always been a challenge about that disparity with the private rented sector. And I think there's huge issues there's been huge issues with the private rented sector from the beginning, about not being able to identify who owners of buildings are, what kind of cladding they had, because there isn't that information out there. And actually the social housing sector landlords, pretty much ready to get, it was a challenge, but they were able to gather that information fairly quickly. We knew how many buildings were in scope. We knew what type of cladding they had. We knew the private rented sector was not the case. The building safety regulator has huge powers. That's why they're sitting in a health and safety executive. They have got teeth. They have got, there's criminal liabilities against accountable people if they don't get this right. The challenge is that there isn't a regulator there to pick up the sort of things that our social housing regulator might pick up. So that sort of stuff where someone's reporting something to the social housing regulator. In the private sector, you haven't got that. So again, I think the challenge of the private rented sector, it remains a challenge the whole way through. Who the accountable person is really challenging in the private sector as well. It might be an obvious managing agent. It could be someone who owns the property and lives in Dubai and has nothing to do with it on a day-to-day basis. So I think the positively, if you live in the social housing sector, you can feel a bit more assured that this will be done and that the measures will be enforced and regulated.
Thank you, Debbie. I'm going to ask Sandy to come in here. Sandy, you had a question?
Yes, all the time there's all these standards that coming in, and it's such a huge long wait. But if all the standards were adhered to and everything was legislated, you could quite honestly see that there'd be a lot of landlords that have to swallow each other up because they can't afford to do most of them, is number one. Number two is the onus is always being put back on the tenant to be involved, to be engaged. But we only have a couple of different portals which can help us. TAROE being one, which has been incredibly helpful, TPAS being another. But you've got to be an engaged tenant to find out about them, which doesn't help the situation, because this is the first time in decades that any council, ALMOs or housing associations have had to stop again and think, resident engagement, got to get it together. So they've never cracked it since day one.
I don't know what says that apart from I agree with you. Yes, you're right. I think, yeah. I think we'll see some real test cases coming through around. I think the HSE will be trigger happy for the first couple of years, and I think we'll see some people being made examples of, because the building safety regulator will also want to see resident engagement strategies. But it's no good to just say, well, we haven't got one, or we didn't have any residents who wanted to engage in it. I think we'll see some people being made examples of, but I don't know what the answer is. Darren, you need to triple the size of your organisation.
Don't we just? Debbie, I think Val's going to want to come in. So just while Val prepares, I'll ask her another question. There's quite a specific one. This has not been raised in the chat today, but it's been raised in earlier sessions that we've had. You highlighted a bit earlier about the responsibilities of residents within the buildings, and that extends. My understanding is that kind of extends to various sort of goods or potentially appliances within buildings. And if a landlord finds that some of those installations are unsafe, they're going to have powers to issue notices and enforcement action against the residents to rectify some of that. That's kind of, on the one hand, that sounds great, doesn't it? But of course, the other thing is, well, practically, how is that going to be a reality? How are they going to know about all of the different appliances? And if they do, and you're reliant on those appliances for your day-to-day activities, maybe it's a I don't know, dryer to get your clothes dry, the kids' clothes dry for the next day for school. Are you going to desist from making use of those appliances? I just didn't know. Have you come across anything? And I say that because I am aware of things like white goods registers that some landlords are making use of in order to assist with that, and even schemes to provide kind of support for replacement of white goods. Have you come across this at all?
This is something that you have, to be honest. I think it's the unenforceable, isn't it? It's absolute unenforceable, because you know you're not going to buy it. They said that Grenfell started by a faulty, I think it was a faulty fridge. You know, you're not going to go and buy a fridge because you know it's faulty and it might catch fire. So you're not going to report the, I don't know. I don't know what the answer to that is. And landlords will be loath to supply white goods because anything they supply they'd have to maintain.
Yeah.
So I don't know what the answer to that is at all. I think again it will be, we'll watch this space and see what happens.
Yeah, something I have seen.
And it also feels a bit, you know, how dare the landlord come into my home and look at my fridge and my freezer, and you know, if you're a homeowner, you don't have someone coming to check that you haven't got dodgy wiring, do you? It's a bit, I don't know, it's a bit uncomfortable, is it? You know.
Yeah, exactly, Debbie. I think well said. Val, you had a question?
Yeah, I was just going to say that you're saying about tenants' voices and them to engage with their landlords, but I've been involved with my landlord, but I find that they're too scared to hear what the residents are actually saying. I think they feel threatened that we're trying to, what's the word, criticise everything they're doing, but part of scrutiny is to criticise if they're failing as landlords. But they're also too quick to blame the residents for the state of the properties. They don't want to take the blame if they're misused, if they're not standards that the regulator has set. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
When you think someone's to take you on board or to take what you're saying.
Yeah, they don't. They're too scared of what we find out as a resident that scrutinises their services. They don't like hearing the truth. They will make up like lip service. They will tell you what you want to hear instead of acting on it. And I've been dealing with that for the last year, like Darren knows, and it goes in one ear out the other. They will just give you some excuse after excuse. And that's why they don't like getting people involved, residents involved in their landlords.
I think, yeah, I was just going to come in there, Debbie. I think, well, to kind of reflect on that a little bit. If we go to the very start of this process, Val, what it highlighted is that one of the primary aims and objectives of this legislation was meant to be about engendering trust.
Yeah.
And I think unless, and I know that Brian has said there about communication and information being key. And I know that's something which you've been sort of highlighting yourself, Val, for a long time as well. What it shows is this is complex. What it's going to require is both effective communication, but also honesty in the way that that's delivered in order to be able to engender that trust. And if people don't have that, if that's not there, then the trust falls away, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it was the fact that, like, you know, Darren, been communicating with you, that this resident's been dealing with the problem for 3 years, and they were quick enough to blame the resident, but it turned out it was actually the housing association's fault, and she's still waiting for the works to start, and it's been 3 years, so it is just going backwards and forwards.
Yeah, I think.
My slight flippant comment on that is that if scrutiny panels aren't being listened to, then they're crap scrutiny panels, and they're not scrutiny panels, they're tokenistic scrutiny panels, and that's not scrutiny.
I think, yeah, I think the other point I'd highlight here is that it's fine that you can put a lot of things into legislation, and you can say these are all of the things that you have to do as a landlord to meet your obligations. But if you haven't got the culture right at the heart of the organisation, then all of the other falls apart. You've got to get the culture right. You've got to have real meaningful engagement, and by that it also means that you listen effectively as well, and that you act upon those messages that your residents are giving back, which I think is probably a good way of being able to kind of sum up where we are today. Debbie.
More point. I think damp and mold and the conditions of properties is this can't be hidden under the carpet anymore. It's very much in the public eye, and I think certainly government can't ignore this. And I think there will be something that happens. And the other thing I was just going to say is I totally agree with your point about culture. And one of the things I talked about a little bit is professionalism, and the lack of professionalism we've seen, not across the board in housing, but in terms of some attitudes and behaviours of staff, which isn't good enough. And I think government they are conducting some kind of review of professionalism and expectations about behaviours of people who work in housing. And one of the pieces of work I'm doing is around what professional behaviours look like and what residents should expect and can challenge against. So watch this space.
Great. Just to sum up, a couple of information things before that will fit into the last 2 minutes. Debbie mentioned earlier about announcements and so forth around fire alarm, smoke alarms, carbon monoxide alarms, and there was an announcement that was made yesterday by the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, where they said it's going to be mandatory within the regulated sector for smoke alarms to be fitted, and they're also going to be mandating about regulatory changes for carbon monoxide alarms to be fitted when new appliances such as gas boilers or fires are installed in any home. So what we will do is we will put a short note together about what that announcement says, and then we'll include a link in the follow-up materials so people can find their way to that. Second announcement just to make is to highlight that just last week the same department, the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities, they have a select committee which has just announced a review into regulation. So that's what they refer to as social housing regulation. And again, we will include a link to that, which is currently live, so that you can follow your link, and there's the option to kind of submit things directly into that select committee. I mentioned earlier that we're hoping to be able to run a future session on tenant satisfaction measures, so hopefully that will be well received. And then finally, it was just again last week, and again we'll include a link to this in the follow-up materials. There was a publication that was issued by the regulator of social housing last week. It's called Reshaping Consumer Regulation, and it really outlines their approach to how the regulator intends to implement what it's going to be required to do as part of the white paper that Debbie kindly outlined a little bit today. So probably again something that we'll be returning to in a future webinar. So I think it probably just remains for me to extend a big virtual clap and handshake to Debbie, to thank her for coming along today. Really interesting, valuable talk, and we very much appreciate you giving your time and coming to speak to us. So thank you very much, and we'll be making announcements about the time and date of our next webinar as soon as we are able to confirm that. So thank you very much. Good to see you all again, and till next time, thank you very much. Bye now. Bye bye.